Hello, my name is Grace, and my project two is about language extinction, specifically the process of language extinction in Indigenous peoples. Language extinction sounds a little strange because you might think about species of organisms when you think extinction. Extinction can occur with abstract ideas such as language as well. One problem we're facing in the 21st century, everything is American and Eurocentric. We speak a lot of European languages, and we kind of ignore the languages of Indigenous people and the people who originally lived in the lands we now occupy. Those cultures all have their own language and heritage, but they are dwindling down to their final individuals. Each of these cultures have traditions and values, and when that language is lost, they're trapped in the vault of a dead language. You might think of a few examples just off the top of your head. There are actually over 2,000 languages that are threatened with being extinct forever. And most of those, we do not have a lot of record keeping. And a lot of these languages don't have a written system at all. So they're either entirely vocal, entirely sign, some unique way that can't be preserved unless an individual is actively performing them. When the final fluent speaker dies, the language will vanish. And that is the process of language extinction. As linguists, we need to understand the natural decay of a language and its cultural influence, and then try to have some preventative measures in place. So I read several research articles, but I actually read most of this book that I will reference in my paper. Um, the scientists studied in a lot of these Russian languages. I cannot pronounce them at all, but up here at the top, you can see an OS, Tuvan and Tofa. He studied a lot of those languages where they had less than 30 native speakers left, and their cultural significance and the words they left behind and their knowledge. He tried his best to preserve those, but he's only one person. You can only do so much. But those were just three examples. That was his life's work. And as you can see, even listed here, that's at least 50 languages. And they're all on the verge of just being completely lost. So there's different levels of vitality based off of a language. So it could be safe, such as English, and we do not have to worry about English going away anytime soon. The first level is vulnerable. So for whatever reason, people are restricting their language. Definitely endangered is when children do not learn at home. They might learn it in school, they might pick up on some key phrases, but when they are babies acquiring their L1, it is not that language, it's a different language. Severely endangered means children and new generations barely know the language at all, and only older generations are fluent. Critically endangered means older generations lack the space to interact with that language and they don't use it often, or they only partially know the language. And once those older generations die, the language becomes extinct because there are no speakers left alive. So different languages are on different levels. I think one great way to put it is to look at South America as a continent. So overall, the indigenous cultures of South America host about 25% of all known languages. So that's thousands of languages, I believe. So out of the current countries, the 12 countries of South America, there are only 5 official languages, which means government documents, road signs, speakers, all these tools we use in language, they're only written in about 5 languages across these 12 countries. And out of those 5, by the way, the 5 are Spanish, Portuguese, Dutch, French, and then, I'm sorry, one that starts with Q that I can't pronounce. But that is the only American language, is that one that starts with Q. The other 4 are European and were there because of colonization. They don't have like a natural occurrence there. So I think that's interesting that out of 25% of those languages, none of them, well, one is actually still used. And that was only in the country of Brazil. So none of the other native languages are used at all, which is sad. So what triggers the death of a language? Sounds pretty dramatic, right? So colonization, especially for indigenous languages, is going to be the main cause. So English is the most spoken language in the world because of Great Britain. There was an old saying that always said, the sun never sets on the British Empire, because they colonized all around the world. So the English language is everywhere. Even though the country is so small, it still has a major influence. But the problem is, while English became widespread, it crowded out other native languages that had more cultural and geographical significance than English. So a lot of the times in colonization, indigenous people are forced to conform, whether that's by blunt force, like through the military, or socially, economically. In some form or fashion, indigenous people have to conform to whatever new society the colonizers have created. And lingua francas are the dominant languages. So, for example, if we use the United States, which I'm sure everyone's familiar with, people used English as the lingua franca, even though there were several different immigrants coming in, and of course the Native American people who are already here, they all used English to interact with each other and assumed that everyone else also knew English. Another example might be like French or Nigerian in Africa, but they're using that dominant language instead of their own personal minority language. Another issue outside of colonization would just be migration. Oftentimes, indigenous communities don't have the highest quality job opportunities, educational opportunities. Many times, especially in developing countries, if you migrate somewhere else, you'll have a higher standard of living, or the opportunity to live in a city. There's also several cases, for example, in Botswana, it was actually banned to speak in your cultural language or wear your own clothes. You had to conform to what the colonizers had. And that made the younger generations not want to take pride in their own culture. So they gave up on the language, the location, basically everything. We do have a need for preservation, right? But should we be monolingual? Maybe the world would be better off if we all spoke one language. Economically, we would have better trade and connection options. We could have better international connections and be more efficient in communication. And Esperanto, as you might know, is a language that was constructed for everyone to be able to learn. So that way we could all communicate through one lingua franca. So maybe ideally that could work. The problem with that thinking, though, is we're assuming that language is only a tool used to communicate and nothing more, that it's purely a tool or an action we can complete. But there's a lot more sentiment behind language. It's an entire culture. One aspect of linguistic uniqueness is that every culture is going to hold information that is specific to them. So one example I found is that over 75% of all medicinal plant services are only known to a single language. So if you think about, again, South America or like the Amazon rainforest, that is a lot of uncovered territory for major languages such as English and Spanish. But these local indigenous peoples have already discovered a lot of plants and medicine and sciences, but they can only communicate in their own language. So if we allow their languages to die, then we lose that information that we may never rediscover. We can see how human cognition really works. If we only looked at English to determine how the brain sorts grammar and its conventions, we would not have as much information as we do today. Some number systems don't use base 10. When we get to 10, we put a 1 and a 0 and we start back over. But some number systems do this at 20 or 100 or 4. They pick different bases. So their systems of math are completely different. That might be crucial to discovering new information in the mathematical field that we're just not considering yet. Another example that is really helpful in the linguistic field is this language down here from Peru. They follow, instead of subject, verb, object, like we do in English, they say object, verb, subject, which previously was not considered as an actual option. Very few languages do this, but the fact that this occurred naturally is linguistically significant. So we can take this to see how brains sort grammatical conventions and such. So how do we keep languages alive if everything seems to be against them? One thing you can do as a scientific kind of linguist situation is create orthographies. And that's essentially what Dr. Harrison did. He went to Russia and he recorded thousands of conversations between people. He did interviews. He wrote down what they were saying. He collected their phonology, morphology, syntax, semantics, and documented everything to create a huge database. This is a different example. This is also from Botswana. This is the phonology of the Kua language, as you can see up here. So having this physical evidence is useful in case the last fluent speaker dies. We at least have documented it in some form or fashion. An easier approach, I guess, because it's less scientific, would be the local activism and what the native speakers choose to advocate for and help in their own local communities. One website I found that was really cool is called WikiTongue, and you can upload your own records and databases, conversations of an endangered language. And they also provide resources that you can hand out to help people make like a toolkit to create these databases, dictionaries. Another common tool is to use the Bible or any other religious text and translate it into that language, because missionaries are a big reason that European societies and ideas have entered South America, Africa, Southeast Asia, etc. So by at least providing a translation of biblical works or fictional stories, they can maintain their own language and still gain the new information. And a final idea is allowing the government to provide resources. Many African countries only provide resources and information in your common lingua francas like English, Nigerian, French, and a couple of others. But almost 1/3 of every African country does not speak the lingua franca. They speak their own native tongue. So they lose access to tax information and resources, road signs. I mean, just about anything you could think of that has to do with the government, they can't interpret, especially when you think about politics and electing officials and such. So it's really significant that they're provided their own resources and they're not just ignored or expected to convert to a new language. To conclude, colonization appears to be the main issue with indigenous languages and trying to allow that to survive, especially in the past like 30 years or so. There's been a lot of efforts to revitalize a lot of all that information and bring people back to the culture that they were once a part of. And the generational trauma can slowly be healed. And then people can be proud of who they are and proud of their language. And we don't have to lose all of that valuable information. Thank you for listening.